Hello YouTube and welcome back to The Outsiders, and for the purposes of this video we're going to be talking all about elves. I promised Andrew of Dawn Forecast's channel that he was going to release a video on elves today, and so am I, as promised. And I'm also going to be doing another one in a week's time about bards, which I promised to do before I have this little break. So I think 1 or 2 videos is not going to harm anybody, and keeps my hand in, as they say. So this is going to be all about elves. It's not necessarily just for Pathfinder, but of course it can really be used for any fantasy genre. And what I'm going to try and do in this video is go over a little bit of the history of elves, and at the same time explain, I feel, some of the best ways to actually think about them to get the best out of the character types. I'm not going to break them down into what you get for the class, because it depends very much on the system, but I'm really going to focus on it from a role-playing point of view, what you can get out of it. So I hope that makes sense. So without further ado, let's have a think about it. The first thing to do, of course, is look at the roots of elves. We really go back and find out where they originate from and some of the reasons why. And some of the earliest folklore, which is both British and Germanic and that sort of thing, really talks about elves as forms of like gnomes, sprites, pixies, that sort of thing. They're lumped in with that group of fairy folk, really. And they were mischief makers, blamed for a number of sort of human occurrences, like hiccups was one of the things that elves were blamed for, would you believe? And it isn't really until you get into the 20th century with books like The Elfland's Daughter by Lord Dansney, I believe, 1924, if memory serves me right, that this starts to become a completely different subject matter, and it's obviously revolutionised by the time we get to 1937 with The Hobbit and Tolkien's fantastic work on the subject, who really then enhances not only the elves themselves, but actually develops a whole language and various other things that we now take for granted in terms of role-playing games. It's really where it all stems from. So of course, once role-playing games came about, it was natural to latch on to the more popular fantasy novels for the process around what elves are. So really, what are elves? What is the fantasy perspective of elves? Well, they're a proud, noble people. And that's always the intent they're given. In most of the works that I've read, they're generally quite tall people. They all seem to have a kinship for nature. They seem to have an affinity for magic. They have long life expectancies. They seem wise beyond their years. If we look at Tolkien's work, and it varies depending on the fantasy game, often they can live for hundreds of years, thousands of years maybe. So they are pretty unique. Yet at the same time, they're fairly frail. They're not big boned. They're not big set. They tend to be quite skinny, quite shallow in terms of that. Probably the wrong word, shallow, but you get the drift. They tend to be quite slim, athletic and slim. Natural archers generally, and have a fantastic affinity, as I say, for nature and animals in terms of general understanding the animals, reading the signs of those animals. So those are the sort of premises of what is an elf, if you like. Now, one of the things, of course, to also focus on at this point is, of course, if we talk about elves and the natural racism that exists between them and dwarves, it's fairly easy to understand why it comes around, doesn't it? Because the dwarves, of course, mine deep underground. They have, if you like, from an elven point of view, is disruptive and destructive, what the dwarves do. So naturally there are odds with nature. Even though the dwarves do actually respect nature, it's something that the elves don't see that as the respect that Mother Nature, Earth deserves. And it's quite interesting as well with elves that there's almost like a fifth column. The Dark Elves, again, act completely at odds with what elves generally stand for, which I think is quite interesting. It's another nice facet to it. So you can see why the dwarves and the elves have this immediate distrust of one another, because they're very much at odds with everything. Also, they're very much, it's that classic yin and yang and chalk and cheese, because one's very tall, one's very short. One is very, bearded. There's even great stories, isn't there, of the dwarves. Even the women have beards. The classic phrase that comes out sometimes from role players. But the elves tend to be fair-skinned, light-skinned generally, very clean-shaven. Again, there's another affinity with most elves. And depending on the fantasy genre, I've seen various things where there are different types of sects of elves, from high elves all the way down to even a wood elf and things like that. So those sort of things all exist in there. So it's quite nice to sort of understand that basis when you dissect the elves down. Now, what this really then builds to is what makes a good elf? What actually contributes, in my view, to playing an elf? The best example I can give is from a player that, in my view, set the standard for what elves should be, and his name was John. John Pike, who did a fantastic job at playing an elf in one of my campaigns, and the best way I can compliment him is that is the standard that I've set every player to since, to be honest, because it really, really captures, in my view, everything they stand for. And I'm going to try to do my best to capture that. How he did it was simply this. He developed as most people do, most role players will, he developed a good backstory about the character, and that, I'll give that as a given. You should expect players to create good backstories for their characters. It was centred around the fact that he was all the things we've discussed: noble, proud, born of a high, expected to lead elves, expected a nobility in the elves is the way he had thought about the character. And so he developed a fantastic, and it's a brilliant way for the elf mind to work, a family tree. And it started out simply with his mother and his father and his kin, his next of, his immediate family, brothers and sisters, and their relationships, and then beyond them, who was the grandparents, and he just built this fantastic tree out. And I think he took it back, if memory serves, about 3 generations. And why this was great is because not only did he do that, but he put it to memory. So what was exciting about this was that when he was playing that character, you had the feeling that this character understood his heritage. This character, everything meant something to him. So great little details came out, which is a fantastic way of playing elves. So he was given a simple sword by his father. Now this wasn't a magical sword or any of that stuff. This was a family heirloom handed down from father to son. And it was more symbolic than actually dangerous, if you like, because all it was a longsword. But to him, it meant everything. Yes, he had a traditional bow, but the sword was part of the family heritage. And so he loved that weapon, cherished it, nurtured it, took it with him everywhere. It was involved in many fights at high level. And it was interesting because the way that he played in how important that was to him, and the process of his son must be handed it off when the time is right. And there was all this sort of brilliant backstory, but I want to come back quickly to what was brilliant about doing this family tree is when the group had lost a couple of characters and somebody wanted to play a high elf, this character really came into its own, because the person that wanted to play the high elf didn't do such a good job at portraying, wasn't a bad backstory, but didn't really have any idea of how he was playing this half elf. And John absolutely did a fantastic job on this guy. As soon as they had introduced and he realised he was, they got discussing, and he said, what are you? What race? Because it wasn't clear to him. What are you? And he said, well, I'm a half elf. And he said, oh, that's terrible. Half elf? Oh, tell me about your father. And the guy stumbled over it. You don't remember your father? My God, I can go back 3 generations. And so he did. He went back and back and back and back. And the guy was dumbfounded, standing there. There was about 15 minutes of him just reciting this family tree and going back about what his family had done, what this had done. And White was brilliant. He said, to become an elf, you must learn to be an elf. And he took him under his wing, and he developed this relationship that took this character from a stumbling half-elf into someone who regarded himself as a full elf. And that was really exciting, and that was all through character play that John had created. And so, in essence, what I'm encapsulating here, what I'm trying to capture, if you will, is, didn't use the right word, but trying to capture, is that this is all about, to be honest, creating a beautiful backstory with a thought process that's very elven to drive the type of character you want. And that process could be used by anybody. You could have that, build a history into your character, you could play very proud, you could play more akin to nature, but still knowing the heritage. And I think if you capture those elements, a lot comes into it. Now John's character also had some really interesting traits about it. It was fairly aloof, he didn't say much, what he said was poignant, very cleverly played, and played well, because sometimes, some of the worst types of role-playing are actually when people overact. They overact it. And he did it really well. Whenever he contributed, because it's really difficult getting the balance right, because you don't want to not say anything and not really contribute. And he got that very well. So he contributed at perfect moments, and it made such a difference to the entire campaign.